Aisha Khan's earliest memories were not of toys or playgrounds like most children her age but of wires, screws, and the faint hum of electricity leaking from the old radios that her father used to stack in the corner of their cramped apartment above the family's tiny convenience store. A shop that barely paid the bills yet stood as a monument to her father's relentless determination to provide his children with more than he ever had, and while other kids chased kites and skipped rope in the dusty backstreets of their neighborhood, Aisha sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, screwdriver in hand, carefully prying apart the plastic casing of discarded electronics that the store's customers would occasionally leave behind as junk, and though her father, Imran, worried she might shock herself, he couldn't help but smile when he saw the sparkle of curiosity in her big brown eyes, because she wasn't just pulling things apart. She was trying to understand them, to trace the flow of energy, to ask questions that no one around her had answers to, questions about how wires carried invisible power, how signals moved through space, and why broken things could be made whole again if you simply figured out the right way to connect them, and this hunger for knowledge grew with her as steadily as the worn grooves of her little hands, until by the time she was 8 she could reassemble a radio faster than most adults could. Change a light bulb, and her proud but weary father would shake his head and say to customers, "This one, she's not like the rest, she's got a brain that doesn't sleep," even though the customers would smile politely and murmur that girls were better suited for softer things, kinder professions, not machines, not engineering, not the brutal coldness of mathematics, but Aisha only heard the unspoken challenge in their tone, and each time someone implied she was misplaced in her passion, she doubled her resolve to prove them wrong. School, however, was a battlefield of its own, because the teachers were overworked, the resources were scarce, and the expectations for girls in her community were often suffocatingly low, with many of her classmates dreaming only of marriage or modest clerical jobs. But Aisha could not confine her mind to such narrow corridors. She wanted equations that danced across pages, she wanted to test ideas with her hands, and she wanted to dream beyond the cracked walls of her classroom, yet dreams have a way of drawing ridicule when they soar too far above the heads of those around you, and so her classmates mocked her for raising her hand too often, for staying behind to ask teachers for extra problems, for scribbling in notebooks during lunch as she sketched crude diagrams of robots she imagined one day building, and it wasn't long before whispers turned to laughter, and laughter turned to jeers, and one boy, the loudest of them all, declared that MIT is for geniuses, not for shopkeepers' daughters who play with trash, a statement that stuck in Aisha's mind not as an insult but as fuel, because she didn't just want to go to MIT anymore, she needed to show them that brilliance didn't belong to the wealthy, that determination was a currency of its own, and so while her peers drifted to television and idle chatter, she spent long nights with the flickering glow of a desk lamp illuminating her textbooks, her fingers scribbling furiously, her brain absorbing algorithms, physics, and engineering principles far beyond her grade level, and though her eyes often burned with exhaustion, she found solace in the silence of the night, as if the universe itself was listening to her whisper, "I will not be stopped." Her parents, though supportive, carried the heavy burdens of survival, and sometimes her mother, Farah, would sit beside her and gently remind her that too much dreaming could lead to heartbreak, that the world was not kind to ambitious girls, and that disappointment was more likely than acceptance. But Aisha, respectful yet unyielding, would kiss her mother's hands and say softly, "Mama, if I don't try, then the world has already won," and Farah, though afraid for her daughter, could not extinguish the flame in her, and so she let her continue, quietly praying that fate would not crush the spirit of the child who dared to believe beyond her circumstances. By high school, Aisha's reputation had grown. She was the strange girl who aced every exam, who beat the boys at math competitions, who corrected teachers when equations were miswritten on the board, and while some teachers admired her, others felt threatened, one in particular, Mr. Henderson, her physics instructor, took every chance to belittle her, calling on her only when he was sure she would stumble, telling her in front of the class that engineering is a tough world, especially for women like you, his tone dripping with condescension that sliced at her pride, but instead of crying, she memorized every insult, turning each into a stepping stone, and on the day of the regional science fair, When her classmates arrived with polished projects funded by their parents, Aisha unveiled a robotic arm built from scrap metal, soda cans, and salvaged wires, and while the judges laughed at the crude appearance, their laughter evaporated when the arm responded to her voice commands with stunning precision, performing tasks that even the expensive kits couldn't manage, and though she didn't win first place, she walked away with something far greater. Proof that her ideas, no matter how humble in origin, could compete against the privileged, and that validation burned brighter than any ribbon could. The journey to MIT, however, was an Everest of its own, because applications required essays, recommendations, and fees that her family could barely imagine paying, but Aisha approached it with the same ferocity she brought to every obstacle, writing her personal statement with raw honesty, speaking of growing up in a cramped apartment, of learning engineering through discarded parts, of her dream to create technology that could serve the underprivileged communities ignored by corporations, and her words carried the weight of her authenticity, so much so that when the acceptance letter finally arrived, her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, and she read aloud through tears, "Congratulations," while her mother wept openly and her father, too proud to hide his emotion, pulled her into his arms and whispered, "I told them you were different," but as joyous as the moment was, the reality soon sank in. MIT was not just a school, it was an entirely different world, a world of wealth, privilege, and pedigree, where her worn sneakers and thrift store sweaters would stand in stark contrast to the designer clothes of her peers, and where her confidence would be tested not only by rigorous academics but by the dismissive stares of those who believed she didn't belong. Her arrival at Cambridge was a whirlwind of awe and intimidation, the campus looming like a cathedral of intellect, its walls echoing with the footsteps of legends, and as she dragged her second-hand suitcase across the polished floors of the dormitory, she couldn't ignore the murmurs of other freshmen introducing themselves with stories of summers at NASA programs, private tutors, and family connections to tech giants, while she quietly placed her books on the small desk by the window, whispering to herself that she was here not because of money or connections but because she had fought her way in with nothing but grit, and yet, despite her inner pep talks, the sting of exclusion came quickly when during orientation one student sneered, "MIT isn't for charity cases," and another laughed, "Don't worry, she'll drop out after the first exam," their words carrying the same bitter tone she had grown up hearing, but sharper now, heavier, because these were no longer the jeers of small town classmates, these were the voices of those who had been groomed for greatness, voices that the world often listened to, but Aisha, though rattled, tightened her jaw and said nothing, letting the silence wrap around her like armor, promising herself she would not respond with words but with results. And so, as Chapter 1 closes on her first trembling weeks at MIT, Aisha finds herself standing at the threshold of the Robotics Center, staring at the glossy floors, the buzzing machinery, and the students clustered around expensive toolkits, her heart pounding not from fear but from anticipation, because she knows that every moment of her life, every insult, every sleepless night with a soldering iron, every tear shed over impossible equations, has led her here, and though the whispers follow her into the lab like shadows, she silently repeats to herself, 2 minutes. I'll show them all in 2 minutes, not knowing that very soon she will do exactly that, not just rewriting a record but rewriting the very narrative of who belongs in the world of brilliance.